Hello, denizens of the internet. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Evelyn Silver, upcoming author of the Bloodline Chronicles Witch's Night with the Wild Rose Press, writer of Bath Book Reviews, aka Books I Read in the Bath, and your disembodied voice attached to a cartoon for the evening. The first official look into Amazon Prime's new series, The Rings of Power, was released recently, and as expected, the racists are angry. They are angry because the cast isn't all white. One comment that stood out to me in my Twitter feed reads as follows: poor grammar and spelling included for authenticity. Horrible casting choice. There are two explanations. How could you cast black elf or dwarf? It's either a deep ignorance of Tolkien's work, or you do not value it enough to follow its rules. I am deeply disappointed. And you know what? He does have a point. Tolkien's work is not for or about people of color. It's a glorification of colonization. That's why modern reinterpretations of the beloved fantasy epic desperately need to include diversity, to start reinvention of this staple of fantasy often credited as being the origin of modern fantasy genre as a whole. Of course, having a black actor in the cast is literally only surface-level change, but it's a good start, and I'm curious as to what direction the writers and directors will take for this show. While I currently write lots of lovey-dovey queer paranormal romance stuff, my first love was fantasy. If it had dragons, elves, magic, witches, or a made-up language, I read it as a child. Most of the people who know me in real life are actually really shocked that my first book is going to be a paranormal romance rather than an epic fantasy. So I'd like to share an essay I wrote for a Native American literature class I took in college, focusing on colonization represented in Lord of the Rings, something I wrote from the perspective of a fantasy reader and a fantasy lover. I hope you'll find it interesting and that the racists find it offensive. Representations of imperial colonialism in the various works of Tolkien. Native Americans are not a group often found in the forefront of fantasy literature. Epic fantasy literature is almost notorious for a specific aesthetic, one of Celtic elves, Scottish and Viking dwarves, and English humans. There is usually a mystical, druidic quality to magical groups like elves, which leads to a very common trope: colonialism of native populations and the need to eradicate or erase the old to make room for the new. Originating from an interpretation of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, this is a reflection of a primarily white Christian notion that their specific culture is the best, most civilized, and the only real future direction for the world to progress in, a notion that started in real life with the original Christian Roman Empire's assimilation and conquest of Europe, and continues to this day in the residual effects from Europe's efforts to colonialize already inhabited countries and continents by destroying the people and cultures they encountered. Since the victors, or self-perceived victors, write the stories, Western fantasy reflects this colonization strongest in one of its most classic of all high fantasy series, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Before diving into Tolkien's elaborate world of epic battles, strange languages, and descriptions of doors that last pages longer than most readers have patience for, one needs to consider a concept which influenced Tolkien's writing: the white man's burden. This so-called burden is a term coined by another author named Rudyard Kipling, who was famous for adventure novels starring British protagonists in colonialized countries perceived by his general audience at the time to be backwards and exotic, such as India, the Pacific Islands, and parts of Africa. This term, the white man's burden, comes from a poem of his, which goes in part as follows: "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go send your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." In this first verse, and in the verses which follow, Kipling makes the argument that the burden of the white man is his superiority to all those who are not white men. His burden is to force those perceived to be lesser to be as much like him as possible for their own betterment. The line describing non-whites as half-devil and half-child is perhaps the most telling line in the entire poem. Calling someone part devil insinuates innate, inborn evil, which is to be feared, loathed, and treated with harshness. In calling non-whites half-child, he effectively infantilizes everyone not like him. Children do not have the same agency as adults. Their intelligence is not fully formed because they are incapable of understanding adult subjects, and so for their own safety and future development they must be wards of their parents. The idea that adults whose cultures are different or whose skin color is darker are children, while white men are the adults, makes a whole range of abuses justifiable in the minds of the perpetrators of this myth, much more so in the time period Kipling was alive and in previous centuries than is the case now. Children were seen as property of their parents, and it was perfectly acceptable to beat a child who was thought of as unruly. Carrying this behavior to race relations and imperial colonialism, slavers may have genuinely fooled themselves into thinking that beating these people was good, and that even if a person fought or begged not to have their language and culture stripped, giving every indication that this was a cruel and unwanted thing to do, that white man was in the right because they were the all-knowing adults. The real heart of this issue in Tolkien's work lies in the relationship between elves and humans. Contrary to what one might glean from a surface reading or watching the movies alone, Tolkien's works do not describe the rising human forces as a conquering force over the once native people when compared to the receding elven race. The idea is not so much that elves must die off or disappear for the sake of the rise of humans, but is in fact more subtly insidious than that. If one only reads the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the impression left might just be that, like many other works of fantasy, the elves represent a dying native population, similar to the mythical and magical stereotype of druids and Celtic tribes that Christianity wiped out through wars, massacres, witch hunts, and general mayhem and cruelty, through forced assimilation and conversion. However, that is not accurate. The Silmarillion is a companion to his Middle-earth-based novels, and details the history of the elves. This history shows what Tolkien thought to be the proper manner in which the white man burden was supposed to play out, and gives his novels an interesting predicament in which the magical elves are not actually representative of native populations, but rather are the conquering white Christians come to civilize the savages in a strange land from across the sea where their real homeland lies. This is why in his other works elves are never childlike and evil, and the race of men, humanity, is never depicted as adults. In fact, part of the catalyst for the entire quest to destroy the ring comes from a petulant, irresponsible, evil, and childlike decision of one human to not destroy the One Ring, as the far wiser and more adult elf says that he should. The Silmarillion speaks from the perspective of the elves as they come to Middle-earth and encounter the Atani, a race of men identified as mortals. These Atani, who are also given a slew of other names and will hereafter be referred to as humans or men, are described in a similar way to show how encroaching Europeans describe Native American tribes, as offensive, crude, godless, and in need of elevation. The Silmarillion states, "Yet the elves believe that men are often a grief to Manwë, who knows most the mind of Ilúvatar, for it seems to the elves that men resemble Melkor, most of all the Anur, though he has never feared and hated them, even those that served them." This passage effectively compares these human beings to the Middle-earth version of the devil. Also, apologies if I completely butchered any of those names. I'm used to reading them, not speaking them. In order to elevate these poor human beings to a state closer to the superior elves, the elves now have to rule and educate them. Obviously, if they saw humans as being similar to the Tolkien version of the devil, then humans were indeed considered half-devil and half-child by the elves. An interesting note is that the elf who founds the royal house that rules humans does not come to humans out of a sense of pity or overt superiority, but more out of a sort of paternal love. Tolkien is saying in this that while humans, and therefore the real-world metaphorical equivalent of people of color, are closer to evil and immature in their development, the duty that the elves should feel towards them is not feel hatred, but love and desire to share their culture and knowledge with them. The Silmarillion says, "Long Felagund watched them, and love for them stirred in his heart, but he remained in the trees until they had fallen asleep. Then he went among the sleeping people, and sat beside their dying fire, where none kept watch, and he took up a rude harp which Beor had lain aside, and he played music upon it such as the ears of men had not heard, for they had yet no teachers in the art. Now men awoke and listened to Felagund as he harped and sang, and each thought that he was in some fair dream, till he saw that his fellows were awake also behind him, but they did not speak or stir while Felagund played, because of the beauty of the music and the wonder of the song. Wisdom was in the words of the elven king, and their hearts grew wiser that hearkened to him, for the things of which he sang, of the making of Arda, and the bliss of Aman beyond the shadows of the sea, came as clear visions before their eyes, and his elvish speech was interpreted in each mind according to its measure. Thus it was that men called King Felagund, whom they first met all of the elder, nome, that is wisdom, in the language of that people, and after him they named his folk Nomen, the wise. Indeed, they believed at first that Felagund was one of the Valar, of whom they had heard rumor that they dwelt far in the west, and this was, some say, the cause of their journeying. But Felagund dwelt among them and taught them true knowledge, and they loved him and took him for their lord, and were ever after loyal to the house of Finarfin. This describes an ideal European example of colonization from the perspective of the colonizers. Translating the metaphor from fantasy to real world, Tolkien is describing a white man coming to a native village where he teaches his language, stories, religion, and culture to the people there who are all too willing to absorb these things. The native people mistake him for a god at first, because they inherently understand that this individual is so much wiser than they are, but the ever-patient and understanding white man stays and lives with them to teach them his true knowledge, for which they love him and anoint them their leader. This is exactly how Europeans viewed their colonialization efforts, and wished that they would play out. Tolkien's views seem to be that the problems only arise when one or both sides of this equation do not play their parts correctly. For example, if the colonizer comes in with hatred in their hearts, or if the colonized do not bow down and abandon their own way of life in favor of true knowledge their oppressors supposedly have to share with them. The final step in the elves' re-education of humans is when they raise the future king of men, Aragorn, also known as Strider and Estelle. While not done in so harsh and terrible a manner as the boarding schools Native American children were forced to attend in the US and in North America, it is interesting to note the similarities between Tolkien's alleged benign, version of assimilation and the reality that was inflicted upon the North America's native populations. Aragorn's father was killed, and his mother gave him up to the elves of Rivendell to be fostered by the elven lord Elrond. At her request, his heritage as a royal was kept from him. He was given an elven name, Estelle, meaning hope and trust, despite his name Aragorn already deriving from the Elvish Sindarin language, meaning Ara to mean king, and Gorn meaning revered, which is not the best way to hide a royal heritage. He was taught to speak Elvish. He even fell in love with and eventually married an elven woman, Elrond's daughter. In all but blood, Aragorn is an elf. In this way, they killed the man and saved the elf, similar to what Captain Richard Henry Pratt claimed was a noble goal in his 1892 speech. He stated, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with this sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." The parallels are uncanny. There is the implication that a human or real-world equivalent non-white should gladly be willing to give up her child to be raised by the elves or the whites. In America, this was a severe problem as the US government, and Canadian government as well, would forcibly remove Native children from their families to be raised in boarding schools, or by non-Native families, effectively erasing Native American cultures and languages from large numbers of children, or at least attempting to. Aragorn's renaming is similar to what happened in government-run boarding schools for Native American children when they were forced to choose anglicized names instead of being allowed to keep their own names and identities. Yet Tolkien's insinuation is that Native American parents should gladly hand over their children for re-education and be happy to do so, as if any sane parent would want their child ripped away from their care to be raised by strangers in a strange culture. There is some nuance within the world of Lord of the Rings as to why Aragorn was raised by Elrond, but the fact remains that he was chosen to be raised by elves rather than by another human foster family. By the end of Lord of the Rings, Aragorn is crowned king and will rule with all the knowledge and wisdom granted to him from his time spent being raised by elves. His king's name is King Elisar, an elven name that literally translates to Elfstone, referring to an elven jewel. His reign is a symbol that the child of humanity has grown into an adult. He is an example of a man who has become civilized and will lead the rest of humanity into that ideal civilization from his position of power granted to him, in part, by the elves. At this point, the elves leave Middle-earth. Their work is done. They have brought their culture to the savage humans and successfully converted them. Tolkien's commentary on society here is not that the old must die or disappear for a new and better to replace it, but that the true purpose of Kipling's white man's burden is not to stay and rule perpetually over the people, but to teach them to rule themselves, only if they rule themselves the way European Christians prefer. Tolkien is saying that Europeans implement the philosophy incorrectly when they decide to hate, destroy, or conquer other cultures and people, and instead should be like the noble elves and back off once their work is done. What Tolkien fails to take into account is the possibility that the culture that has been so drastically altered is not one that is inferior. He depicts humanity's early days in Middle-earth as inferior because that is how he views people of color and their civilizations. Instead of trying to see the beauty in something that is different, he proposes that everything must become more elven, i.e., more white. In his ideal world, non-white cultures would willingly give up their languages, religions, and way of living, and even their offspring, for the chance to be just a little more like elven society, ignoring the possibility that there is value in those languages, religions, ways of living, because he is perhaps too brainwashed to be capable of understanding such a situation from any point of view other than his own. The choice to make humanity, a group that Tolkien and most of his readers would associate themselves with, simply due to the fact that they themselves are human, the colonized rather than the colonizers, seems to be an indication that he believes if he were part of an inferior, I say inferior in quotes, culture, he would submit to any wiser culture that sailed across the sea and encountered him. It is as if he is saying, "See? We'd do it too if our situations were reversed, and we'd be grateful for it. You should submit to our true knowledge." There is no such thing as an inferior culture. If, say, a Chinese empire were to set out conquering the whole world and made it all the way across Europe and into Britain, there isn't a chance that Tolkien would give up Christianity in exchange for Buddhism, or English for Chinese, despite Chinese culture being very rich and at times in history more technologically advanced than Europeans. Tolkien's is an ethnocentric viewpoint incapable of true empathy with groups he is not a part of. The Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit, and all of Middle-earth and Tolkien's world has become a staple off of which almost all modern fantasy is based. As a result, this imperialist colonial mentality lives on. Sometimes the roles are reversed, and it is the elves who are the natives, or some other race of fantasy beings, but the general idea remains the same. One way of life is better than the others. While modern fantasy books have been taking steps forward in producing much more varied and nuanced fantasy, we still have some ways to go. It is up to fantasy writers of the future to change that notion and promote the idea that there is no such thing as an inferior culture. Literature has come a long way since Tolkien's era, but the lack of widespread awareness of this colonial trope within his novels proves that there is still a long way to go. To diverge a moment from the essay, I would also like to address one point that usually people preface with the statement, "I'm not a racist, but..." and that is that Tolkien's works are specifically based off European cultures, and so should have a European cast, because it's faithful to the original mythologies of Celtic and Viking or Norse lore that it's based off of. I think this isn't a completely baseless desire when mentioned in good faith, but it isn't as if we're lacking for European representation in fantasy, and it's important to remember that this is a fantasy world. It can ultimately look like whatever the creators interpreting the world want it to be. Just because Tolkien couldn't imagine a fantasy with the good guys weren't all white, doesn't mean that we in modern times have to adhere to it like it's a Bible. Tolkien was a visionary, but he wasn't perfect. I'd also like to say that there are indeed mention of black characters within the work called the Haradrim, so it's not as if the idea of people of color having a specific role within Tolkien's work doesn't already exist. However, and it's a big however, given the colonial history of European culture and the advocacy for it within Tolkien's texts, there's absolutely nothing wrong with casting actors of color for parts that are not the Haradrim, for example, elves and dwarves. Modern fantasy, to me, is kind of like America as a country. It may have started with heavy European influence, but it is a place that is supposed to be for everyone from all cultures. And the representation of Haradrim is, well, you remember this scene with the elephants? This is supposed to be them. Honestly, when I watched the movies before reading the books, I had no idea that the humans allied with Sauron were supposed to be black, which it may be for the better that the decision was made not to make all the bad humans black. That's a little bit yikes. In short, yes, Tolkien's world already has a place for black people that isn't black elves. But Tolkien was also a bit racist, and revamping his stories for modern audiences in our blended world will only elevate the story in the long run. What do you think of the points raised regarding colonialization in Tolkien's works? Share in the comments, I'd love to hear from you. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to show support for future content, and be sure to check me out on my WordPress blog, Twitter, and all those various social media links in the description. Au revoir, and have a fantastic night!